What do I do as a parent if my child really wants to do an activity, see friends, or engage in a special interest? However, doing so dysregulates their nervous system and there's a nervous system fallout afterwards. So I'm going to start today's Coffee with Casey on this topic because I'm living it as we speak, but it's also something that comes up very frequently when I'm working with families, especially those that are further along in their journey and when their child's out of burnout. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is you might have a PDA child who's more extroverted, a PDA child who really likes sports, a PDA child or teen who likes to engage in things outside of the home. And so they go to the soccer practice or they go on a play date, but then they come home and there's a nervous system fallout where you see that nervous system activation has accumulated. And so how, as a parent, can we navigate, hi from Mexico, hola, how can we navigate this edge of the child really wanting to do something, but we know that because of the structure of the activity itself, they're perceiving losses of autonomy and or equality, which even subconsciously builds in their nervous system. So I'm going to do a 10-minute training on this, and then we're going to jump into the questions. So this is something that's happening right now in my family where my son, his current special interest, he's 8.5, is football. So he's collecting football cards. He's playing football at school with his friends. He has joined his first in his life group sport or team sport because in the past, the expectations of engaging in a particular way on a particular timeline and going to practice are too many perceptions of threat because those are all expectations, losses of autonomy, and equality if you have a coach who's like, do this, do this, do this. So he is very fired up and excited about engaging in his special interest. However, we are noticing dysregulation during the practice, like crying throughout the entire practice, and then less dysregulation and more fun during the subsequent game, which is a 2-hour thing on Sundays. So we've been on this edge of like, is this too much for his nervous system or is he enjoying it? Do we help him push through or do we pull back and make decisions as parents? And so I wanted to just share with you 4 things to help you navigate this should this come up as an issue in your child's or teen's life. Okay, so the first question we have to ask ourselves, and this is a really important one, is are they actually enjoying it, right? So like when I work with parents, they often say, oh, school's going great, they like it. But really what's happening is their child is internalizing the threat response or masking, and they seem fine at school, but they're actually not enjoying it or wanting to be there, okay? So we have to ask ourselves and do that like honest inquiry, and sometimes it can be hard to tell of, is my child actually enjoying this activity or are they masking? Okay, so that requires really learning your child. And for my husband and I, we're able to discern masking from enjoyment, which took a while. The second is, and this is what I'm going to be teaching in depth, 2-week intensive for the Progress with PDA workshop. It is tracking indicators that help us understand how engaging in that special interest, going to football practice, hi everybody, is impacting his cumulative nervous system activation. So what does that mean? That means we're looking at basic needs, like is his eating dropping off? Is he having more trouble sleeping? And now he has a Fitbit, so I can see like how many times is he waking during the night? Is he having trouble with stomach aches? Is he vomiting? Is he having, digestive issues, etc.? So far the basic needs are good, right? So that's one indicator. The second is the equalizing behavior or the expression of the nervous system. And so we are seeing more of that in the home and at school. Okay, so this is another thing we're tracking, nervous system indicators, and it's complex because we have a lot of other variables in our home right now. The transition from our old au pair who's been with us for 2 years is leaving today, and a new one has moved in, and it's the end of the school year. So that's like the second thing we need to understand how to do as parents when we're navigating this edge of like, do we push, do we pull back, do we accommodate, or do we support them through this thing that they want to do? But because it's the nature of a football practice where there's a coach who's above the players and where there's drills that you actually have to like go through at a particular time, there will be perceptions of threat for a PDAer. Okay, so the third thing is connection and trust and communication. And this is something that builds over years, right, of constantly signaling safety and autonomy. But at this point in the game, my son trusts that we would never make him do anything that his body can't do. And his father has volunteered to be the assistant coach in order to be there for nervous system regulation and to mitigate some of the like yelling at the kids, right? But having this foundation of connection, trust, and communication is also what allows us to really be sure that he's enjoying himself and not masking. For example, yesterday in occupational therapy, at occupational therapy, we integrate the special interests. So we lay out football drills, we throw the football, we talk about football, we look at stats for football, right? So it's facilitating his participation and enjoyment. But he yesterday was talking to the OT with whom he has a very close relationship about how he doesn't want dad to come over when he's having a hard time at practice, unless he's crying, in which case dad should come over. But he just wants dad to be the coach. And he says that when he's on the field, he feels like he's in control of his life. That's what he said verbatim, and can just be a normal kid. That's what he said. And so what he was communicating is like, he wants to be there. It's hard for him. He wants dad there, but to like ease off a little bit and let him like have a hard time and retreat when he needs to and not necessarily have dad come rushing over. Okay, so that took us years to get to the point where we had that level of trust. And then the fourth is developing self-awareness in your child, which has to do with like naming the threat response and developing a positive and affirming identity that is open-ended and your child will lead you. That's something I teach in the Paradigm Shift program. But having him be able to talk about himself in the way of like, I'm PDA, but I don't need dad to be a dad of a PDA or when he's coaching, right? Like he had that language. So those are the four things to think about when you are navigating that edge of your child being out of burnout and potentially wanting to engage in activities or special interests, but those activities or special interests, especially with other children or people, will necessarily introduce some activation to the nervous system. Hi, everybody. Okay, so that is what I wanted to share with you guys. And I am open to questions, a couple questions. So I'm just going to look to see. Oh, hi, Kate. See if you guys had any. Okay, screen time limits during burnout. All right, so I do not give like, do it this way or this is what you should do, because I don't believe that there's a blanket approach for children, because it just depends on a lot of factors. So I'm going to give you some things to think about so that you can make your own aligned and attuned decisions based on what you see in your home. Okay, this is a question I get a lot. The first thing I would say is for many neurodivergent children and especially PDAers, a screen is regulating to the nervous system and potentially a source of learning, right? Like often when children are in burnout, my son included, you see them starting to re-engage with things like drawing, playing, coloring for the first time while they're on a screen, right? Because it reduces that sensory input and distracts from the underlying nervous system activation. It can also facilitate like eating or bathing, right? Like my son always eats in front of a screen, and at times when he had a harder time with hygiene, we would set up the iPad so that he could bathe, okay? So we want to think about screens as a tool that is neutral, that is not good or bad, but potentially more of a need for a neurodivergent brain. However, we have to tune into indicators of our specific child, okay? So this is what, like, if we were coaching, I would ask you, and especially if you're trying to discern burnout versus addiction behaviors, and thinking about the context of your family system, because what we have to understand, there's 4 things. This is not advocating for screens. It's just objectively, there are often only 4 things that regulate a pediatrician's nervous system. Another safe nervous system, which means constant undivided attention from you. Often you're the only one. A special interest, which they may or may not be able to engage with when they're in burnout because it's too difficult. Novelty, dopamine, or sensory seeking activities, and or screens. In burnout, it's often the only 2 are screens and another safe nervous system. So there's a direct trade-off for you of not allowing a screen, because if you're not allowing a screen, you have to be paying undivided attention, or there's dysregulation and escalation and potentially dangerous behavior towards siblings, breaking your stuff towards you. Okay, so that's a trade-off, and that's a decision point. You have to observe what's true for your child. The second thing is we want to be asking ourselves, not just, what we know to be true for our family, but asking ourselves what we're observing, what data we're seeing. So like, is your child more regulated after, like not the transition, but afterwards? Or are they getting really dysregulated after a lot of time on a screen? My son did better with unlimited screen time. That's something I observed. That's not always true for PDA kids, right? And that's something you have to observe and trust your intuition on, of like, oh, if I let my kid on the screen for 6 hours, things are actually getting worse in terms of dysregulation, not better, right? Second, we want to be thinking about, like, how are they using the screen? Are they using it to, as I said before, eat, bathe, learn things, regulate their nervous system so they can rest, so they can actually like engage in something like drawing? Like for me, that's a different use than if you're just observing your child like increasingly needing more violent, more stimulating, more sexual, faster and faster content all the time, which is like signaling more of an addictive behavior, right? And so we want to be observant of that, right? And so we want to ask, what are they doing when they're on the screen? How are they using the screen? How are you observing them in the long term with overall regulation levels? And you might need to pan out for a couple weeks and experiment of like, not just a day, because when they get off the screen, unless we're replacing it, you're going to see escalation, right? Often parents are like, screen time limits, and then they don't replace taking away that nervous system scaffolding with some other nervous system, right? And of course they're going to escalate because that's the nervous system disability of like baseline dysregulation. And are we seeing addictive behaviors, right? And I would say with my coaching and work with families, I have probably worked with like over 500 families at this point, maybe more than that. And I would say like 1/5 to 1/6, like we have seen addictive patterns and we need to tune into that. So it's not a blanket answer. And that's something that you want to look at mindfully and objectively, but also understand that like screens are a tool. They're not bad or good, which is like where you need to decondition your societal norm stuff of like counting the hours and then determining like if you're a good or bad parent depending on how much screens you gave them, right? Oh, so Nicole says, we just signed up our son for flag football. Yeah, it's flag football, and my husband is the coach, 100%. Our son wants to play, but didn't get any flags first practice and is now shut down and refuses to participate. Yeah, so this is what happens, right? Like, And it might not always be like that. It depends on where your child's cumulative nervous system is. Hello. Hi, kids are watching too. Hello. Hello, hello. Hi, guys. So happy to see you. Yes, eating is a big for us too. iPad in the bath here too, and while eating, 100%. Anecdotally, which drugs have been effective for anxiety and ADHD in PDAers? Okay, so the first thing I want to say about that is like anecdotally, but also corroborated with research on autistic individuals and SSRIs, only about half have positive benefits. And I think this depends both on genetics, but also like the root cause. Is it generalized anxiety that's driving some of these behaviors, or is it purely the threat response or something else? So there is a degree of experimentation here. The two most commonly used SSRIs that I have heard of in the PDA space for children are sertraline, which is what my son and I are on. Hooray. I don't know what my husband's on, but you know, we're an anxiety prone family, if you haven't noticed. And Prozac. So those are the two. However, we want to be really careful because there can also be side effects, right? And so like some of them are when your child's adapting to the SSRI, like tummy aches or more sensitive stomach or not being able to sleep, and they go away, but there can also be suicidal ideation and more dysregulation. So you really want to work with a developmental pediatrician. Anecdotally, I have heard that guanfacine for ADHD is the best fit for PDAers because sometimes stimulants can mimic the nervous system activation. And we also can mistake a lot of the hyperactivity that we associate with ADHD with actually like flight behavior. And so if we're treating the wrong root cause, it can be counterindicative. Again, I'm not a clinician. These are just like patterns and observations I've seen. And so, yeah, it's something you have to experiment with within the medical system and a trusted pediatrician. Also thinking about like how you're going to administer and if you have a sufficient degree of trust between you and the child to actually allow for the pill or liquid to get into their body in a way that's not going to like create a lot of demand avoidance and or rupture trust, right? So, you know, you want to be thinking about that in a mindful way because some of the therapeutic and medical things that can actually help our child, if we introduce them too early and when we haven't established trust and gotten them below their threshold, can actually backfire because we're trying to force them into a therapeutic modality or a medication, which is a loss of autonomy. Okay, cool. Katie, we're starting a psychology panel for our high masking 4-year-old tomorrow. What are certain subject matters that I should bring to the forefront to the doctor so he understands our child? That's too broad a question for me to answer without a little more context. I'm sorry. Help. Any guidance for young adults with late diagnosis who haven't had the opportunity to learn the tools and mechanisms to okay, again, too broad. Like I could like just get started with you on a 3-month coaching package. Guidance for young adults. Yeah. Guys, if you ask more specific questions, I think I can be really helpful. And I'm not saying that to be annoying. It's just like when it's like, what should I do? Like, I can't answer that because I don't know you and I don't know your child. Yeah, short TikTok clips to learn things or watch puppies. Does the nervous system over time become less triggered by demands? Okay, so that question, it's a good one. But the underlying assumption that your question is asking, the question you're asking is based on is the assumption that your child will get used to nervous system activation. And this is a common misconception because PDA is framed as an anxiety-driven need for control. And anxiety is treated through, appropriate levels of little bits of exposure, and you get used to them so that you can overcome things that make you anxious, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. This is what you do in therapy for anxiety. And I know because I've been in therapy for anxiety for since I was 26, and now I'm 41, so 15 years. And I don't think that exposure-based methods for treating anxiety are wrong. I think they're just a reflection of the wrong root cause of what's going on with our children, which is a nervous system activation that happens subconsciously, autonomically, and immediately and reflexively from the nervous system when there's a perception of threat. And that's based on a perception of a loss of autonomy or equality. You can increase the window of tolerance, meaning the accumulation is less, so your child isn't at the threshold, and if they are activated, they still have that activation, but they're not going to be pushed past this threshold where they're not able to eat or sleep or exist out of fight, flight, freeze. However, that activation doesn't go away. They don't get used to what's essentially a survival or a trauma response, right? And so we really need to be careful about how we're understanding and conceptualizing what's actually going on, and not err on the assumption that if I just push my child through nervous system activation, they'll get used to it, right? And nervous system activation is happening subconsciously and internally. And this is why I mentioned football, right? My son loves football. It's his special interest. He's with a friend from school. His dad is there. He loves it, right? But on a subconscious level, every time he's told what to do, the coach puts himself above him, he doesn't catch a play or grab the flag, his brain is perceiving, I'm gonna die, right? And so it might be worth it because he has a window. Football might be worth it for his self-concept and his enjoyment as a child to have some of that activation, right? But the activation is still there. He's not used to it. He's just not at his threshold, and he recognizes what's happening. So he's not in this state of potentially being traumatized because he's ascribing meaning and inescapability to this experience that he's chosen. Okay, so I'm just trying to help you shift the mindset because this is a sticky one and it sneaks up on me too. And this is why I distinguish between anxiety and nervous system activation and disability. Okay, again, the question, are there therapies that can help them to learn to feel calm with the demands or losses of autonomy? I think that the way to think about it is we need to accommodate a child away from their threshold so that they're in their thinking brain more and not always in their survival brain, which is the frontal lobe where they can actually learn. But in order to get them there, we need to accommodate and provide autonomy, which sometimes includes not making them go to therapy until we have trust and they have consent. Okay? So this is why it really needs to start in the home often, because that's where trust is most easily established. Yeah. SSRI party. They started our 8-year-old with an antipsychotic. It was so nervous to give it a try, but it's really helping. Yeah. So I've also heard of PDA kids taking Respiridol and some other ones that have been helpful. So as you can tell, I'm agnostic about medication. I think our kids have complex brains, and a lot of what we see is not just PDA. So we need to experiment with learning to support their brains. Yeah, my son is in burnout and used his iPad for eating, bathing, etc. What about when his younger sibling is seeing his unlimited screen time and wanting the same? She did. Yeah, so that's a question about boundaries and limits that you decide for your family, and how you want to set up your parenting differently to reflect one child has a nervous system disability and it sounds like the other doesn't. So you are going to be approaching things differently, which will dysregulate your non-PDA child, right? But that's a question about like prioritizing and the cost-benefit decision of what you're setting up in your home as the system. Good. I'm so glad it was helpful. She did have lots of other interests, but now only wants the iPad and then cannot get off and causing lots of meltdowns. Yeah. Anyone have experience with their child chewing on their shirt? Yeah, that's super common. Oral regulation is very pronounced in PDA children. So like my son used a pacifier until he was almost 8 outside of school. A lot of kids will like chew on the edges of tables or mantles, breastfeeding well beyond what's considered typical for oral regulation, like 5, 6, people don't talk about it because it's like societally not okay, but oral regulation is strongly soothing often. So if this is like a sensory need or a regulation thing, that's not uncommon. So sometimes jewelry can help, although, often with PDA kids, we introduce sensory accommodations, and because they haven't asked for them, they're like threat and they won't use them, just like headphones. Yeah, I just saw we tried jewelry. Young adults quitting, okay, more targeted question. All right, I got you. Young adults quitting jobs at the moment. There is conflict, not wanting to work because of the demand. Yeah, so we want to think about the way that the PDA brain works, right? So I don't know anything about your family, but it sounds like you're coming to PDA recently. Just from the way you're asking the question, there's no judgment in the way I'm saying that because you're asking like about the demand. Young adult, if they're in school, potentially masking, and this is very common for more internalized expression because parents often come to it later. I don't know if your kid's internalized or masks. There's going to be a lot of accumulation of nervous system activation, which happens every time on a subconscious and automatic level in the amygdala. Every time they feel that someone is above them and not equal to or below them. Anytime they feel there's an expectation that they did not consent to or have autonomy around, anytime there is a loss of autonomy, freedom, and choice. So in a job, at least in the US, in a traditional setting, you're going to have all of these triggers that your child is perceiving, whether or not they're aware of them. And it's building in the system, right? And so what you want to be looking at to understand your child is like, how is it impacting their behavior, fight, flight, freeze? How is it impacting basic needs? Like, are they increasingly not sleeping? Are they increasingly, struggling with encopresis or UTIs or, bathroom stuff, and then connection and engagement? Okay, so those are indicators of what's going on beneath the surface for your child or young adult. And we want to tune into that because what our conditioned mindset is like, they committed to the job, they have to do it, I need to teach them responsibility, they can't just give up, I'm not a good parent if I don't make them do it. That's why we're shifting the lens to like, oh, actually they have a nervous system disability, it's built to this point. What they're communicating through their behavior and potentially what they're saying is like, my nervous system can't do this anymore. So they might need a break, right? And as a parent, providing that autonomy and compassion is what builds trust every time you do it. Yeah, my son tends to navigate to stressful content on a screen. It's kind of a masochism. I need a way to redirect without creating a demand. Okay, so Jose, I want to reframe something for you. I need a way to redirect without creating a demand. I don't have a way to do that. I mean, we can incentivize them with your undivided attention or something novel or like, I don't know how old your kid is, but like if it's a younger kid, going on the trampoline, going to a water park, engaging in something exciting that distracts from the nervous system dysregulation, or offering your undivided attention, that has to be on the other side of getting off the screen. But this is more a question about boundaries, right? And so why I say I don't have a way to do that is because the nature of PDA is if you set a limit or a boundary, which you may need to, depending on the situation, there will be nervous system activation, right? So the question is it important and is it worth the cost of activating my child's nervous system for the benefit of setting this boundary? And sometimes the answer is yes, which means you then must de-escalate and get into the mindset of de-escalation, and witnessing through the panic attack or nervous system activation is the accommodation. Okay, I know that's a lot if you're just coming to PDA, but I just want to plant that seed. Do you have indicators for what complex trauma looks like versus burnout? They're kind of the same thing, but complex trauma is associated with... Okay, so just to distinguish, PDA can exist without complex trauma, and complex trauma can exist without PDA. However, if you have a brain that's constantly perceiving threat on a subconscious level, and it's building towards a threshold that all of us have, eventually we're going to be in the space of trauma, right? Because if your nervous system is activated repeatedly and you don't know why, so you're perceiving it as inescapable, and you've ascribed a meaning to it of like, I have no agency, I'm completely trapped, it becomes traumatic, right? And most of our kids have experienced complex trauma before we understood PDA. I mean, it's part of the nature of like learning, I mean, myself included. So they're often intertwined. However, complex trauma has to also do with, like, if it was complex trauma without PDA, it has to do with like evocative cues of a person, scenario, situation of like, you know, a child, maybe there's like a child in a situation where they were abused and they associate a smell with the person that abused them, like a particular deodorant or aftershave. They are going to smell that aftershave or that deodorant and have the evocative cue to the survival part of their brain that they're in danger, right? And have a trauma response that could look very, very similar to PDA response because they're both nervous system related, fight, flight, freeze. The evocative cue is not necessary for the PDA activation. It's just the perception that I am below someone else, something, or some situation, and or I don't have freedom and choice, right? So that's from birth. That's genetic. It's not because something happened, right? Evocative cues can develop around things like toileting or a person through forcing our children to do things without understanding how their brain works. So part of this is an empirical question in the sense that we might not know what can be healed, which is complex trauma, and what remains as the nervous system. And so what I mean by empirical question is like we have to approach a child with PDA in a trauma-informed way, but also accommodate, right? Because like trauma-informed approaches do not go as deep with autonomy. Like they often rely on more boundaries and limits and different ways of approaching the child. There's an overlap, but they're not the same thing entirely. It's kind of a long answer. That's something like I would go much more deeply into if we were in a program together. Okay. Mommy to mommy. How do we help our school teacher to help our 6-year-old? Oops. So the place I would start is actually I have a master class for $25 called to School or Not to School. And there's a PDF, there's 5 PDFs. And one of them is like how to interact with your teacher, how to advocate, things to think about, and handouts. Yeah, okay, I think I'm going to answer one more question. I don't understand it when people try and request to be in the video, like on a live. What does that mean? Like, you want to join me and do a presentation? Okay. All right, I see some stuff about encapresis. Yep, it's not uncommon. Oh, I'm so glad, Jose. I hope to be helpful. Yeah. 10-year-old very recently, after waitlist, COVID waitlist in 6. Ooh. Daughter diagnosed autistic, suspected PDA, currently in major depressive episode. How, when is it possible, helpful to tell her? Okay, so this is like a sequential question. And I'm just going to tell you like how I structure it with families. So like the way I structure it in the paradigm shift program, which is like the signature, the logic of it reflects this question. Okay, so the first thing we do is we understand deeply the neurobiology of PDA and like everything that is happening inside your child's brain. So you want to make sure you understand that first before you're teaching it to your child. And mindset shifts. The second is the cost-benefit framework of how to make decisions in the home. The third is intensive accommodations, and we're actually doing like a whole month of that. And we're doing this tracking, and we're going through like the 10 most effective accommodations and how to experiment, and there's frameworks and all that. And then the next module, which is 8 weeks in, is this question, okay? Which is like, once you totally understand your child, learn how to make decisions, understand how to accommodate them so that you're starting to model for them how to manage their disability, then we introduce building on the accommodations like strewing and declarative language and autonomy, how to introduce this concept of identity and threat response. And we separate them because we all have a threat response. It's a human response. It's based on the nervous system. But the identity is something that they can come to autonomously. Some kids choose PDA, autism, ADHD. Some choose nothing at all. But we incorporate the principle of autonomy into the methodology of helping them understand their identity. So I can't go further into that right now. But what I want to say is what's most important is modeling for them what you want them to learn before we put names on it. And if they've already received diagnoses, and this, again, I wouldn't know from alive, but you want to understand, like, have they received previous labels? How have you seen them and observed their reaction to them? What's your connotation and energy around it? Like, we just want to be mindful of all that before we're ready to, like, introduce and offer possibilities, right? Because we don't want to impose on them from a place of like, I'm the parent and the doctor told us this is you, right? Loss of equality and autonomy, right? So we really need to rethink how we're introducing identity and threat response naming. Okay, that was a long live for a 15-minute coffee with Casey, but I hope it was helpful. It's great to see you guys. Always happy to see your faces and your questions, and I will see you guys again soon. Oh, and the accommodation intensive progress with PDA workshop, May 15th through 30th is going to be like intensive, just focusing on how to track indicators and accommodations. And it's like, we're going to experiment and workshop, and it's going to be awesome. It's the last time I'm doing it live. So if you want to join me, I'd love to see you there. Okay. Bye.